Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar, the HITRUST Assessment Handbook Series, Reporting and Maintaining a HITRUST Certification. My name is Dennis Palmer and I will be your host and your moderator. As we go through the presentation, please feel free to enter your questions and comments in the chat directed toward the panelists and we will address those at the end. The recording will be made available to participants a short time after the completion of the webinar. In addition, we will follow up with any questions we're not able to address during the webinar as needed in a separate session. Okay. At this point, I'd like to introduce our presenters. We have Vincent Benekers, Vice President of Quality, Ida Moniki, Director of IT Audit and Assurance Services, and Bob Musselman, Director of Quality. Vinny, take it away.
Thanks, Dennis, and thank you to everyone for joining today. Today is the final topic in our webinar series related to the Assessment Handbook. We thank everyone who's joined the previous webinars. Those recordings will be available, and we'll be able to provide you links to where to find those in the event you weren't able to attend those previous topics in addition to this one. So going into today's agenda topics, today we're going to cover much of the content in Chapter 15 of the Assessment Handbook related to reporting and maintaining a HITRUST certification. This includes really great information for those of you that maybe haven't gone through a reporting process before or a full certification cycle, as well as we're going to cover content to describe some unique situations that might be encountered after an organization has achieved their certification. So we'll start with going into the reporting process, and we'll discuss the different reports that are available based on the assessment type that you go through, and we'll also talk about the process in the event reissuance is necessary. And then we're going to dive into items that come up while you're certified, so that this is around maintaining your HITRUST certification. We'll talk about the interim assessment that's required to be performed for R2 assessments, the new rapid recertification, which is going to be available to those customers that have previously performed an I-1 on version 11. And then we'll talk about the general recertification process for all the assessment types. And we'll dive into what a bridge assessment is and who might be eligible or want to perform a bridge assessment. After that, we're going to dive into discussion around some unique situations organizations might encounter when it comes to significant changes or security events. So going right into it, I'm going to turn it over to Bob, who's going to talk about reporting.
Thank you, Vincent. We'll move to slide 5. We'll talk about the 3 types of reports, CSF reports for which we would issue a certification. They are, next slide please. They are the newest one, the Essentials Threat Adaptive 1-year report, 1-year certification report. Scores in all domains must meet for each domain an 83. Moving to the next most recent type of report, we have the implemented I-1 report. Like the E1, every domain needs to achieve an 83 to achieve certification. Ida will talk a little bit more about recertification, rapid recertification for the I-1 a little later in this presentation. And then lastly, we have our risk-based R2. For this one, each domain must score at least 62 to achieve certification. Also, the unique item about this, it requires an interim to maintain certification at the 12-month mark. Now, if these scoring levels aren't achieved for all 3 of these their respective scoring levels, then we would issue a validated, non-certified report only. So keep that in mind. Which segues into a readiness report where an entity may not be pursuing certification. They're going to want a readiness report. It is available for the R2, the I1, and the E1. It does use the standard methodology and the requirements and the tools that we provide through the assurance program. Think of it as a dry run, exactly what a readiness assessment is. And QA is not performed on this type of effort. And why would you want to do it? Very useful in seeing maybe where gaps are and set up remediation strategies for that. Let's move to the next slide. Got one more report type to talk about, and that is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework Report. Now, this is only available for the R2, and the scoring threshold is 70 for the NIST MAP CSF requirements. Like the other reports, if 70 is not achieved, a validated only, which is a non-certified report, will be issued. The unique thing about this one is you could achieve certification for the CSF report, not achieve certification level for the NIST report, or vice versa. So that's something to keep in mind. It doesn't have to be certified for both reports to be a valid. All right, next slide, if you will. Let's talk a little very quickly about the steps in the reporting process when the QA process is complete. The draft reports are built. They're reviewed for my team in quality. We look at every report that is getting ready to be published or posted. It is our layered approach to quality, so my team works with assurance. We review every report. When this is being done, the assessed ND is notified. We're in the reviewing and draft deliverables phase. So at the end of our review, the assessed ND has 30 days to review the draft report. If they don't review, moves to the next phase in revising the draft, the system automatically will move it if the assessed ND hasn't reviewed it or approved it. Also, during the revising draft phases, we have a request revisions. There are some caveats to this. Changes to scope, factors, and scoring cannot be requested during the draft revision phase. Lastly, upon the assessed ND's approval of the draft report, if no revisions, or if there are revisions, once they've reviewed and approved, the last step is HITRUST will prepare and post the final reports, and then the MyCSF will move. MyCSF will move to the complete phase. The assessed ND and external assessor will be notified that the final reports are available, and the marketing team will send a press kit to the assessed entity. Let me touch on, report reissuance. Next slide, please. Once a final report is posted, unless there are extenuating circumstances, we would not reissue a report. Some of the questions that come up, what is an extenuating circumstance? Largely, the common question is a name change does not necessarily qualify for a report reissuance. And of course, we review every request to make a determination for this. To be considered for reissuance, assessed entity must have an active MyCSF subscriber subscription. The assessment cannot be archived. And the reason why is we would need access to the object. So that's the driver here. And the final report must have been issued within the last 6 months. When you do make an exception request, please describe the circumstances and the rationale for the reissuance. And again, as I mentioned, we'll review to determine whether we can approve reissuance. So that concludes the reporting type section. I'm going to turn it over to Ida for maintaining a HITRUST certification section.
Thank you, Bob. Now that you have your certification with HITRUST and you've obtained your report, there are some key items you need to be aware of. And if you've gone through the HITRUST certification process so far, these are whatever I'll be covering is depending with the type of assessment, the type of validated assessment you have. It's something you probably have come across or you come across this year. So I'll start with the R2 validated assessment, and then I'll cover a little bit in regards to an I1, and then we summarize what's the process for recertification. So the next slide, if you've obtained an R2 validated assessment, it's a 24-month certificate with HITRUST. And to maintain that certificate, you're required at the half point of that certification for you to attest that nothing has changed within your environment. So HITRUST does require you complete an interim assessment, which we do issue an interim letter. So at the 90th day window before your first 1 year anniversary of your certification insurance date, the interim assessment may be completed. And usually my CSF will notify you when it's available, when it's you can build your interim assessment. What is the interim assessment? The interim assessment really comprises of at least one requirement statement from each domain, so about 19 requirement statements, and also any caps that have been fully remediated, those requirement statements will also be included. So just keep in mind to retain your certification, some of the requirements to be able to maintain your certification and also to perform an interim assessment instead of a full assessment at the 1 year anniversary. We look to make sure that there has been no significant changes to the scope of the current certification. There are no security events that have taken place that would impact the in-scope environment that was certified. There has been no degradation of the control posture. And how would you know this? It's most likely of the sampled requirement statements, none should have lowered scores, because that's an indicator something has changed with the controls in that environment. And also for any caps that were identified during the full R2 validated assessment, there is significant progress. If they are not fully remediated, you should be able to show significant progress. I would also like to point out, and we'll cover what this is later, a security event or a significant change does not automatically preclude the ability to retain a certification. We do encourage the assessed entity, the customer, to report these events to HITRUST, and we will work with you with our process. We'll cover that towards the end of this session. So that's to do with an R2. To maintain your certification for an R2 validated assessment, within the 12th month, we expect you complete an interim assessment at the 1 year anniversary. Then something new this year, the next slide, please. For all assessed entities that have completed an I1 assessment, we have the option to accelerate, complete your next I1 certification with an assessment we are calling the Rapid Recertification Assessment. This is new starting 2024, and it's the difference between a Rapid Recertification and an interim assessment is that the Rapid Recertification, yes, it's a sample of requirement statements that will be reassessed, but you do attain a full report. An interim assessment, at the midpoint of an R2 assessment, you get an interim letter. So with the Rapid Recertification assessment process, it's good to note you can't do two back to back. So I have a good visual for you on the progress or the timeline of performing an I1 Rapid Recertification assessment. So for those that will meet the criteria, you must have a full I-1 assessment in year 1. Then the second year, you can perform an I-1 rapid recertification. The third year, you have to perform a full I-1 assessment, and it must result to certification. So in case you ended up with a validated honorary report, that would not qualify for an I-1 rapid recertification. The next slide, I would like to cover the criteria of that allows the customer or the assessed entity to know if they qualify or for an I-1 rapid recertification. As we go to 2024, there are several I-1s that were completed within the CSF version 9. Those will not qualify. All I-1s that qualify for an I-1 rapid recertification must have been completed based on the CSF version 11 or later. The scope is the same, so the scope has not changed. There has been no significant changes within that environment since the certification date, like business or security processes or controls, or even changed your hosting location. So the sample may be the same, but some key aspects of the environment may have changed. So if there has been any significant changes, then you will not qualify for a rapid research. Also, similar to the interim assessment, there should your environment should not have materially degraded in terms of the control. And again, this will be determined by the scores. So if your scores are lower than they were previously, that may be an indicator. And then also you must have an available assessment object within MyCSF. And finally, your current I-1 certification, you must have an active I-1 certification that you want to recertify. The next slide, let's talk about a couple of things that you need to pay attention to as you think through the I-1 rapid certification. And this one is mainly for the assessors as well. So what will be assessed within an I-1 rapid recertification? There are three main things. One, if there has been any change with the CSF version and we have new requirement statements, all the new requirement statements will be included in that review. Then you'll be required, the system will select a sample of 60 new requirement statements to be tested again of the 182. Previously, we had communicated that all requirement statements that had caps must be tested in addition to the 60 requirement statement. We've since updated that. So the sample of 60 requirement statement does include any requirement statements that required caps. So for example, the example we are presenting here in front of you is if you had 5 requirement statements that required caps, then the system will randomly choose 55 more. If you had 10, the system will choose 50 more. So with the with the requirement statements that required caps, they are just part of the 60. And then finally, all requirement statements that are marked as not applicable, that are NA, you'll be required to assess those as well and provide the rationale, just like any other assessment. What will not be assessed is that if you do meet the criteria and you're performing a rapid recertification, if there are no, in addition to the new requirement statement, the sample of 60 and any marked NA, the other requirement statements will not be assessed. And also, if the CSF versions have changed and there are requirement statements that were previously tested that are currently not within the object, those two are not included. So similar to all assessments, and we've continued to communicate this, we expect the assessor will test all requirement statements with the same level of rigor and also detail. So it doesn't change our expectation of how the testing is done, but it will be fewer requirement statements than performing a full assessment. Then when you're in the process of performing the rapid recertification, there is a possibility that can change. So the next slide is a visual of possible options that can lead you to do a full I-1 certification. So if we go to the next slide, we wanted to outline possible paths where controls may degrade. And this is my CSF will detect this for you. This is not something you'll perform manually. My CSF logic will be reviewing this for you. So initially, if you've qualified for an I-1 rapid recertification assessment, my CSF will select your sample of 60. And as we mentioned previously, that will include any requirement statements with caps. When you're testing it, if there are instances of 2 or fewer requirement statements that indicate control degradation, it will allow you to complete it as a rapid recertification assessment. In case there are 3 or 4, the system will indicate for you to select an additional 60 requirement statement or choose to perform a full I-1 assessment. If you choose an additional 60, depending with the results of the scores, if you have 5 or fewer that show instances of control degradation, the system will allow you to proceed and complete the assessment as a rapid recertification. If it's 6 or more, the system will prompt you to perform a full I-1 assessment. And finally, when you start with your initial 60, if you have 5 or more instances of control degradation, and as I mentioned, the indication here is with your scores, it will automatically prompt you to perform a full I-1 assessment. So just keep that in mind. If you can start off with a rapid recertification assessment and end up performing the full I-1 assessment. And then the next part, I want to do a quick recap on our recertification process on the next slide and highlight a few things. At the beginning of this, we highlighted how long, depending with your validated assessment, how long the certification is. For the E1s and I1s, it's a 12-month from the report date. With the I1s, you have the option to utilize, if you qualify and meet the criteria, to utilize the I1 rapid recertification during the recertification process. For the R2s, it's valid for 24 months, but at the 12th month, we expect you've completed an interim assessment. And usually for R2s, you can also have an option to utilize a bridge assessment. I'll talk about that in a minute here. But for here, what I really wanted to highlight is your reassessment fieldwork period is key to maintaining your certification and not having a gap. So if you complete your fieldwork testing with a signed management letter as of the date of your recertification, you're good. But if you complete after that date, there is a potential to get a certification gap. And for example, if your recert date is January 1st and you completed your fieldwork January 15th, that means you have about a 15 to 14-day gap. So it's important to watch for that so that you're aware you can get a certification gap. So the next few slides for this segment, I want to cover the bridge assessment. So the bridge assessment, if you is only available if you've completed an R2 validated assessment. So the bridge assessment allows any assessed entity, that's an organization, to maintain their form of HITRUST certification status for an additional 90 days. Going back to my example of January 1st, if your recert date is January 1st, and you're not able to complete your testing for fieldwork, your retest work by January 1st, then you can apply and complete a bridge assessment that buys you an extra 90 days. What this does, it just demonstrates your environment will unlikely degrade from when your certification expired in January 1st. And then also that there won't be any significant change to the controls in that environment, and that you're intending to complete the next R2 assessment by the time period provided. So it gives you 90 days from the date of the recertification to have submitted that to HITRUST. So please keep in mind, it adds the days, it allows the assessed entity to maintain their recert date, but it does not extend the certificate. So you're really taking out time from the next certification. So the sooner you submit to HITRUST, the better. The next thing is, if you've published your assessment for inheritance, it does not remit our system from unpublishing that. So the system automatically unpublishes your report the day your certification expires. And again, this is just for R2 assessments, so this does not apply to E1s or I1s. So the next slide is the criteria for being eligible for a bridge. So you must hold an active R2 validated report with certification. You must not have missed your recertification date by more than 30 days. And if you go to this section of the assessment handbook, we are providing clear guidance that you can apply for these 60 days ahead or up to 30 days after your recert date. I'll go through the timeline in one of the slides coming up. You've not reported any breaches at the assessed entity that have occurred within the scope and the scoped control environment since your certification was issued. No significant changes in the scope control environment have occurred since the HITRUST certification was issued. And those two things are a recap of what I had said earlier. There should be no security events or significant changes within that environment. And the final criteria here is you must, the assessed entity intends to complete a full validated L2 assessment prior to the expiration of the HITRUST bridge certificate. And remember, the security event or significant change does not automatically preclude the ability to perform a bridge. It just means you need to report that to HITRUST and follow through our process so we can guide you appropriately. And then finally, I believe the next slide is the timeline for the bridge assessment. Next slide. Just keep in mind, this is just an illustration of the timeline for a bridge assessment going back to my January 1st date. So if your 24th month ends on January 1st, you do have the opportunity to apply for a bridge at the 23rd and 24th month. If you identify earlier that you won't meet your reassessment fieldwork testing by the recert date, also, if you identify you will not meet it, but you're still within the next 30 days, that's like in our illustration, the first month for the next certification 1B, that's the period you can apply for a bridge assessment. And a bridge assessment is an attestation that by selecting a sample of one requirement statement per domain, the assessor tested to confirm the environment has not changed. And once that's submitted, it goes through a QA process. If we confirm you've met everything, our expectation, we do issue a bridge certificate. So please keep that in mind. This is for R2s only. It doesn't extend your certification. It just allows you to keep your recert date. You must submit it within 90 days, and that's important. So it's the other assessments, you can complete fieldwork and then submit to HITRUST and still keep your recert date if it's before the recert period, the recert date. For a bridge assessment, you have to submit within 90 days to HITRUST for you to still keep your recert date. And then finally, it deducts those 90 days from the next certification period. So it's important to submit your assessment as soon as possible to HITRUST. Don't wait for the 90 days if you can submit it earlier. So, and that covers this segment of some of the key things you will come across as you're maintaining your HITRUST assessment. For the next segment, we'll hear from Vincent, so I'll turn it now to Vincent.
Thanks, Ida. Can go on to the next slide. So there are two unique situations that I want to cover that not all organizations encounter within their certification lifecycle, but they do require reporting to HITRUST. So as such, we've described in the Assessment Handbook the processes for each of these situations. So can you go on to the next slide? So starting with significant changes, the first thing I want everyone to remember, the certification is really only valid for the scope and the controls that were assessed in that particular organization's certification. But what if something in that organization's environment changes? Well, HITRUST does have a process for handling those situations. And our goal in this process is really to provide a path for the organization to maintain a current and accurate certification. So the first step is really around notifying HITRUST. So when an organization identifies significant change that might impact its certification, it would notify HITRUST through that support@hitrustalliance.net email box. But how does an organization know if a change is significant to start with? Well, what is a significant change? Well, a change, there's really two factors that an organization should think through when a change is occurring. Number one, does it impact their security or privacy posture of the assessed environment? And number two is, does it impact the scope of their certification? So that would include the systems, facilities, or infrastructure and scope of certification. So you can ask yourself, does this change impact what was previously assessed? Either one, the scope, or two, the controls that were assessed. And we'll go through on the next slide some examples of significant change activities. But before I do that, I want to draw a distinction between a significant change and a scope expansion. So a scope expansion would be something such as adding a new platform or a new application in the scope of a certification. And that's something that would really require the performance of a new assessment. A significant change is really when things have moved or been replaced within the scope of the certification. And it's those changes that only partially impact the assessed environment. So there are occasions where the change may be so significant that if the change does impact the entire assessed environment, that may also need a new assessment. So what are some examples of significant changes? Can you go on to the next slide? So keep in mind this list isn't comprehensive, and the situations will vary. Just because something's on this list doesn't mean it's definitely a significant change, and there's certainly activities not on this list that might be considered a significant change. But going through this preliminary list, the first two items are probably the most common changes that are reported to HITRUST, and this is around moving the data center or facilities that were in scope of assessment to another location. It could be moving it to a cloud environment. It could be moving the in-scope platforms to a new data center. And so these are changes that would require retesting the new facility where those platforms and systems were moved to ensure those particular controls are still in place. The next few items are really around changing the underlying technology that was in scope. So moving from an in-scope SAP platform to Oracle, changing the backend database to a different platform, or adding new functionality that enables it, an in-scope system to be accessed from a public location. I do want to mention when it comes to new functionality, most of those types of changes, development changes, are not considered significant changes. And that's because we know a lot of applications, there's a lot of development that goes on, and there's going to be a lot of functionality changes. What would bring it into the scope of a significant change is if it really changes the risk of that organization related to what was assessed in their certification. So in this case, in this example, where the platform is now accessible from a public location, there are probably some HITRUST requirements that may have been marked as not applicable in the previous assessment that are now applicable to be assessed for that organization. So that's some of the things you can think through when it comes to new functionality. The next few items on the list are really around change of responsibilities in the control environment. So it's maybe bringing IT function in-house or outsourcing that IT function. It could be a change in the oversight of the particular control activities. And then a change in control governance. So that's often with an acquisition or a merger that can change the policies that an organization has related to controls or who's responsible for performing those controls. Some items that are not typically considered significant changes would include upgrading an OS or database version. This is something that's in the normal course of an organization's operations, so that similar to patching, that would not be considered a significant change. Tool changes, those may not be considered significant changes as long as the process, personnel, policy all remains the same around performing the control activity. So for example, if you're moving from one change ticket application to a new change ticketing system, if the process for documenting those changes, approving those changes, testing those changes, if all that hasn't changed, then just changing to a new ticketing system alone would not necessarily require reporting as a significant change. So what happens upon notifying HITRUST of a significant change? Well, what we first want is for the organization to provide details on what's changing, including the timing, the nature, and the impact of the change. The organization can discuss the significant change with the external assessor prior to reporting it to HITRUST. We encourage that so that the external assessor may have some more experience with significant change, with handling significant changes for other customers, so they may know some of the questions and information that we'll be looking for. So once you've provided those details on the change, then we'll review and provide some next steps related to the change. We may have a discussion to get further information. So some of the further information we may ask is for you to provide analysis, or the external assessor to provide an analysis of potentially impacted HITRUST requirements. As mentioned, we'd want to understand the timeline of the changes, and one of the reasons for that is to determine how we can document the testing of anything that's changed. So in some cases, we would document that testing within the interim assessment. Or if it's not close to that interim period, we may need to document some of that testing in a new assessment object. And then the external assessor would perform any new and or additional testing that might be necessary. So going on to the next slide, I'll cover a situation that I hope doesn't come up, and that's related to security events. But first, what is a security event? It's really any incident, security incident at the organization, including, for example, a data breach that impacts the certified environment. And so when we say certified environment, that's the in-scope systems, networks, facilities that were previously assessed and certified. Some commonly reported incidents that we've received are typically related to ransomware, data exfiltration or data exposure, or account compromises. So once HITRUST is notified of the security event, we'll want to review to understand the nature and root cause of the security event with the organization. Our overall goal is to make sure that the control environment is still operating effectively. So to that end, we would expect the organization should be able to identify any control failures, and we expect the organization would remediate any of those control failures. And on the next slide, I'll go through that process in some more detail. But one other thing I want to note before we get to that is if we do identify that there was a control failure that resulted in degradation of the control environment below certification thresholds, we may suspend the certification. Our preference is to find a path for remediation and retention of the certification because one of our goals as an organization is to ensure organizations maintain proper levels of security. So we'll first make sure that we perform a thorough investigation before reaching that conclusion. If we do suspend a certification, we'll give an opportunity for the organization to remediate any of those controls and have them retested. So we'll provide that process on how to remove the suspension. During a suspension, what happens is that the organization cannot use any type of inheritance, external or internal, and they would not be able to communicate that they are currently HITRUST certified. So going on to the next slide and what our investigation process looks like. So the first question is really around, did the security event involve the scope of the organization certification? If it does not involve the scope of the certification, then it would not require reporting to HITRUST. If it did involve that scope, what we would want to look for is, was the root cause of the security event due to a failure of previously assessed HITRUST requirements? And this is likely where we'd bring in, have an independent party or an external assessor assist with that investigation and help make that determination. If the answer to the question is no, we still would want to understand what was the root cause. Since our certifications are threat adaptive, we want to ensure that they're covering all relevant threats and organizational risks. So if something is not currently in our assessment that was the root cause, we would want to evaluate if that's something we need to consider adding into our certification assessment. So if the root cause was due to failure of certain HITRUST requirements, that's where we would look at, did the failure of those requirements result in lower maturity scores than previously assessed? So one example would be if there were certain accounts that were compromised by an attacker, and that attacker was able to gain those accounts through a download of the account password database. Well, one of our HITRUST requirements is that the account password database is encrypted. If it turns out that password database was actually not encrypted, but in the assessment it was scored at 100, then we would consider that control is not operating. And so that's the score of that requirement would then be 0. And so we would look at overall the combination of all lowered scores across the assessment to see if they still reach the certification threshold. If that combination of lowered scores results in the organization not achieving the certification threshold, that's where we would suspend the certification and provide those next steps for remediating and retesting the controls to remove that suspension. If those combination of scores did not If the organization still achieved certification threshold, even with that combination of scores being lowered, we would not suspend a certification, but we'd still require the organization to remediate and retest those requirements that were not operating effectively. So those are all the topics for today's webinar. So now I'll turn it over to Dennis, who will go into Q&A.
All righty, thanks, Vincent. Thanks, everybody. We did have a number of questions come in during chat. Appreciate everyone putting those in. If you'll give me just a minute here, we'll get ready to get these lined up, and we will answer these live here on the call. So give me just a minute here, and we will get started. All righty, so the first one we had is, can you clarify what is meant by degradation? Is this referring to exceptions in the current testing where the previous year was tested without exception? Ida, can you take that one, please?
Oh, sure. Thank you, Dennis. Degradation, we mean a control degradation within an in-scope environment. The main indicator will be lowering of any scores during your current assessment. It's not so much the results from the previous assessment. So as you perform your current assessment, if any of the scores are reduced that were previously higher, that's an indicator there was control degradation. So depending with the control, the requirement statement, and how many, that will be, the system will have a logic that will determine if the degradation level still qualifies that assessment to remain a rapid recertification, or the assessed entity will be required to perform a full assessment.
Awesome, thank you. It came in a different order, but this is related to the other one. So is there a certification, is the certification gap some sort of a disclosure in a report, or is it just a theoretical concept? So in other words, if they have a certification that ends on 1 April and they have one that starts on 3 April, when we talk about a certification gap, can you explain that? Vinny, that's more of your line.
Yeah, I'll take that, Dennis. So as you mentioned, it is the period between the expiration of the prior certification and the recertification date. And that's based on the date that the organization signs the management representation letter, which is upon completion of field work. So some customers have a sensitivity in the certification date due to perhaps contractual obligations to remain HITRUST certified. So they don't want to have that gap in the certification dates. So that's when we refer to a certification gap, that's what we're talking about.
Awesome, thanks, Vinny. And then there's two of them that are around the rapid recertification. Just as a quick heads up, there will be additional detail in a HITRUST assurance advisory that we are publishing that will show you all these things written down so that you can get the specifics on it. At a high level, what will happen is 180 days prior to the expiration of your current I-1 certification, you'll be notified that the rapid recertification eligibility questionnaire is available, and this is actually done in your current I-1 certification. Once that's completed, then if it's determined that you're eligible, then you can opt in to do that at that point. And then you would basically contact your customer success manager to make sure you have the correct permissions, and the object would generate from there. At 120 days, the object does generate, and at that point, then you may begin to do the work on that. But all these details are going to be in a HITRUST Assurance Advisory 2024-001, which will be out very shortly. And for those folks who are concerned about it, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact your customer success manager. We've already reached out individually to a few folks to make sure that they're aware of the process and the options that they have. One thing, Ida, you may know the answer to this. On the rapid recertification, I believe I know the answer, but please verify my response here. On the rapid recertification, does it indicate on the certification letter or report that it is a rapid resort, or does it just say I-1 certification? I believe it just says I-1 certification.
You're correct, Dennis. There is no difference. And the objective for the I-1 rapid restart is really a benefit to the assessed entity in terms of in relation to the level of effort if that environment has not changed. So there are no markers and there is nothing indicating it's any different. You'll get a similar report like the previous I-1 report.
Okay.
And I would like to also add quickly, there is a question that came up, Dennis. If there are any new requirement statements in the I-1 version, are those new requirement statements tested, to be tested, included in the 60? No, it's the 60 plus any new requirement statements in the new I-1 version.
Yep.
Thank you, Dennis.
Awesome. Thanks, Ida. Okay, this is a good question. We get a lot of questions on this. So what would be the decision criteria between notifying HITRUST of a change in your environment, between assessments, and determining whether there's a need to notify for a significant change in the environment and or modify the certification? I know that's kind of a roundabout way of asking it, but Vinny, I think you can put some clarity on that pretty quickly. I think we have a section and actually some attachments in the handbook that speak to that. Do you know those offhand?
Don't have the chapter offhand, but yes, to answer your question, customers should notify HITRUST as soon as they're aware of significant change that will occur or has occurred in their environment. So at that time, that's when HITRUST will coordinate with the customer and or the external assessor to determine the appropriate path forward, and whether that's to reassess immediately or if it can be addressed in the next R2. And it's highly dependent, it's very situational on the impact of the change to the certified environment, on whether there would be a need to immediately reassess according to the change or not.
Yep. And I will say this, I work with the customer success managers and the other folks here. If there's ever a question, please contact us first. We're more than happy to talk through these and make sure that we're keeping everyone on the right path and up to speed there. I participate in probably one of these calls a week just to make sure that we're keeping everybody on the right certification path. And then this is known for the rapid recert. I think you already covered this one. For the new requirements in the I-1, yeah, I believe you answered that one previously. So it's the 60 plus any new requirements that were brought in due to cyber exposures. Okay, and then this one, we had a question on how do you require organizations to report security breaches to HITRUST? We have some wording around it. I'll let Vinny take that one.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. So when a customer submits their assessment, as part of the assessment submission, they sign a validated report agreement, VRA, and in that VRA, they agree to report any security events and significant changes to HITRUST. That covers both of those categories. So that's what's agreed to upon the submission.
Right. And then, so this is a great question. I work on this one quite a bit also. The question is, are you able to change assessors after the initial assessment, either for an interim, and I'm going to insert some wording, so whoever asked the question, I'm kind of modifying your question a bit for clarity. Can you change the external assessors after the initial assessment for an R2 assessment? And this would also apply to the rapid recertification. Yes, we do allow you to change assessors. Occasionally there comes situations where there's a resource gap or something like that, and you need to get that submitted in a timely fashion and performed. And so yes, we do allow you, as long as they are an authorized HITRUST external assessor, any firm can perform that. It does not have to be the same one that did the initial assessment, and that would be accurate, keep me honest here guys, for both the R2 interim and the rapid recertification on the I-1.
Yes, that would be correct, Dennis.
Great question. Okay. And then I had another one that just came in. How do you manage significant change after you've already performed the interim? Vinny?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So if it's after the interim but before the recertification, what we would have to do is create a new object to document that testing. And as I mentioned earlier, it is highly situational depending on the impact of the change and how close it is to the reassessment of the R2 to determine if that's a necessary step we need to take. But it would require documenting that testing of the change, of what changed in a new object.
Alrighty. So for my panel, do we see any more that we need to add? I think we've got all of these. All right.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and close this out then. So I'd like to thank our panelists, Ida, Bob, Vinny. Great topics here today. A lot of good questions. I want to thank our participants for sending in those questions. They're great questions. We always like to see interaction on these webinars. I will say this once again, if you do have any questions that we weren't able to cover here, please feel free to contact either support or your customer success manager if there's something that comes up after you review these. I did check. There was a refresh issue on the webpage. So for those of you who are looking for the recordings, if you go to the very top link that I sent at the beginning of the chat, or if you just go into our events page on the HITRUST website, we do have the recordings available via direct link. So feel free to hop in after these. These should be refreshed either, I'm hoping today or tomorrow. We'll get that website updated and you'll be able to view these recordings. This one should be available probably in a couple, 3 days. We'll try to get this published up pretty quickly. But I want to thank everyone for their time. And there we go. Thanks, April. One of my attendees just said that they did see the links are updating. So there should be a couple other videos available now to review. Want to thank everybody for your time and have a great day. Thank you.